Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this emergency briefing about the situation in Fasher, Darfur. My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm the Director for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East at Refugees International. I've been following Sudan for a long time, earlier 20 years ago on Save Darfur, and recently with Refugees International traveling to places affected by displacement, including along the border in Chad and Darfur, where there was an earlier bout of violence in Artamata, where we heard much of similar things that we are hearing, I'm going to hear about today. I'll be moderating today, and we're joined by a great panel that has been in touch with people on the ground in and around El Fasher, and also in one case updates from the air in the case of satellite imagery that has helped to add some evidence to what we're hearing or seeing in videos and hearing from people on the ground. This briefing is on the record. Each panelist is speaking in their own capacity and on behalf of their own organizations. After brief statements from each of the panelists, we're going to open up the floor to your questions. And we'll just ask that you please identify yourself, your media outlet, and the panelist your question is directed to when you're submitting your questions. And you'll do that through the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. With that, let me begin with our first speaker. You'll see their short bios in the media advisory, so I'll just jump right into it. Nathaniel Raymond is with the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. Natty, the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab yesterday released findings from the satellite imagery and on-the-ground verification in El Fasher. Could you summarize some of the evidence you're seeing of mass killing and house-to-house searches, civilian displacement, and explain why those actions may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even genocide?
Thank you, Daniel. So we are at a point which can only be described as the sum of all fears. In the summer of 2023, in July, the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health conducted a private briefing for the UN Security Council, warning that without immediate action, El Fasher would fall under siege in the coming months, and it would result in likely mass killing, ethnic cleansing of non-Arab populations in El Fasher. We can now say that based on satellite imagery evidence collected and analyzed by our team yesterday, that mass killing, including house-to-house clearance operations by the Rapid Support Forces, is now occurring in El Fasher. What we see in one neighborhood, as an example, in Darajula, a place that was known to be housing thousands, an unknown number, but in the thousands of civilians during the siege, we see vehicles in what we call a tactical formation consistent with house-to-house clearance, meaning that they're blocking side alleys and paths with vehicles. And what we can see is objects on the ground throughout that neighborhood that are consistent with about 1.5 meters to 2 meters, which is the average height of an adult laying horizontally on the ground. In at least 4 instances in that neighborhood, we see a discoloration on the ground around objects of those sizes that doing color analysis, it is red. What we believe is happening in those discolored areas is bleeding. We can additionally see by the berm, the earthen wall we've identified as now fully encircling El Fasher. We see through change detection and comparison of images, additional new objects throughout basically a trench line near the wall, measuring 1.5 to 2 meters, consistent with reports of people being executed by the berm or being killed attempting to leave El Fasher by breaching the berm. Additionally, we can see civilians on the road multiple directions, including at least towards Tawila and what was formerly Zamzam Camp before it was captured by RSF in April. What's concerning about what we're seeing on the road is not that there's a large amount of civilians, actually quite the opposite. the number is much smaller than we would expect, which is consistent with reports that people are trapped inside the city and unable to flee. Additionally, we are seeing significant vehicle activity by RSF consistent with consolidation of control of the critical points formerly occupied by Sudan Armed Forces, such as the 6th Infantry Division headquarters. And we see evidence of absence of SAF at their artillery base and at the airstrip. Additionally, we are seeing RSF deploy new vehicles that we have not seen before, including the first time we've seen the deployment of main battle tanks of T-55 armor in defensive positions by RSF. I want to make sure that the headline is clear before I turn it over to my colleagues. Right now, what we can see from space is that there are house-to-house killings, evidence consistent with house-to-house killing activity by RSF. We can see objects consistent with bodies on the ground throughout multiple areas of El Fasher and around the berm. This is only a snapshot 24 hours out since RSF took control. At this point, when we're talking 250,000 estimate in terms of civilians still trapped inside the city, we are only at the beginning of a wave of violence that will continue to put bodies on the ground. Last point I want to make here is I've been analyzing satellite imagery with my colleagues of situations like this for 15 years. I've been working on these types of issues for over a quarter of a century. In my entire career, I have never seen a level of violence against area like we are seeing now. To put it simply, this is only comparable to Rwanda-style killing from what we know in the first 24 hours. Over.
Thank you, Natty, for that sobering brief. I want to remind everyone to please enter your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom, and after our one round of questions, we'll open it up to those Q&As. I want to turn now to Emi Mahmoud, who is the director of the Darfur IDP Network and a longtime advocate and humanitarian working on Darfur, and has a number of accolades, including recently being named one of the Time 100 Next honorees. Emi, I want to ask you what you're hearing from folks in and around Al Fasher in Darfur, especially from those fleeing Al Fasher, and what immediate priorities or forms of international support are most needed to sustain the local indigenous-led humanitarian networks on the ground.
Thank you so much. And I guess what I want to do is first start by saying I'm from El Fasher. I lived there. I went to school there. I worked in Zamzam camp, and most of my family was there. And so for us, it is very harrowing because the IDP Humanitarian Network has been around for more than 20 years now, since the start of the Darfur genocide. We built Zamzam camp. We built most of the IDP camps there. And so for decades, we've been warning that the Darfur genocide has never ended. And for the past several years, we've been saying that, you know, we're going to witness the final stages of the Darfur genocide, especially after Zamzam camp massacre, the Al Janarian massacre, the Zamzam camp massacre. We warned that the Al Fasher massacre would happen. I remember being on BBC in April saying that if we don't do something now, you know, and it seems like every single time we get closer and closer to the next step. What's happening on the ground right now completely corroborates everything that Nathaniel was saying. I've seen videos of entire ditches and trenches full of our friends, neighbors, and family members' bodies. By some estimates on the ground, it's upwards of 10,000 in the first couple of hours, people killed. And the other thing I want to say is that it's not just through bullets. There's been reports of possible chemical weapon use, and there have been several reports of family members, entire families hanging from trees. I've seen pictures, I've seen videos of our, you know, aunts, our sisters. It's very difficult because throughout this entire war and through the Darfur genocide, sometimes you find out that your family member is dead through a photo or a video that's being circulated. And this time is no different. The RSF is filming this themselves and they're gloating about it. And the killings are ethnically motivated. So anyone that they find in Al-Fashir right now, the last we heard before the media blackout, every single person that they find is being killed, women, men, and children, and then they're being gloated over, and racial epithets are said. This is no doubt a continuation of the Darfur genocide. On top of that, it is a proxy war involving several different rich nations all over the world. And this is something that civilians in Sudan have been warning about for a very long time, and those of us in diaspora as well. It is only in the interest of civilians to end the war. It is only in the interest of some of the greatest powers in the world to continue the war. Because the fall of al-Fashir to us does not just signal the continuation of the genocide, it signals that RSF will not stop here. Al-Fashir is the road to Khartoum. And so now that they've taken al-Fashir, and there have been attacks in the Nuba Mountains as well, there's it's very hard to describe, but I've walked across Sudan and I can describe it to you. There's it's almost like there's two main focal points of Sudan, and there's Khartoum and there's Al-Fashir. Al-Fashir is the door to the rest of Sudan, and many people mistakenly think that RSF just wants to separate Darfur. They do not want Darfur. They want to take over the entirety of Sudan, and they will not stop. And they're not above killing everyone in their way. I have to also point out that it is not only Himeti that needs to be spoken to end this massacre. There are several other actors and players that even used to be part of the SAF. And, I will talk about that a little bit more later, but I just want to say right now, for us, we're completely out of time. I think that we need as much support as possible, not only to be able to help everyone who's arriving in the different areas where we've set up camps, but we also need a way to make sure that everyone on the ground is not going to just immediately die. The last thing I want to say is that everyone was already facing starvation conditions for almost 2 years, and even Mbaz, the animal feed that our family members were depending on, was running out before this. And so I just am at my wit's end, but I'm here to tell you every possible thing that you could need to know for us to move on this. Every major nation that's involved is a US ally. As an American, I'm ashamed that we let this happen.
Thank you, Emmy. I want to turn now to Jeremy Konyndyk, who's the president of Refugees International and a former high-level official at USAID, who's dealt with a lot of different humanitarian crises. And Jeremy, I know you spoke recently also with some of the volunteer networks of Sudanese on the ground and got some emotional updates from them. You've also spoken about the role of the UAE as the primary international backer of the RSF, as we know, has provided weapons and diplomatic cover that has helped to fuel the violence going on in El Fasher. Could you tell us what concrete actions the UAE should be taking immediately now to stop the killing, and what leverage the international community has to compel them to restrain the RSF?
Thanks, Dan. And thanks as well to Nathaniel and to Emmy for those powerful, excuse me, for those powerful interventions. So just to start with what we heard yesterday, talking to some of the leaders from the mutual aid networks, the reports that they are seeing and hearing and that they relayed to us yesterday are very consistent with what both Emmy and Nathaniel have described. We heard specifically that in El Fasher town, civilians are being killed in mass numbers. We heard that civilians are being detained. Well, many people are being detained. We heard that the RSF are blocking people from fleeing the town. And specifically that rather than allowing them to go south and west, south to Zamzam and west to Tawila, they are forcing them east, where there is not safety. So everything that we have heard is very consistent. We also heard specific reports that people who tried to flee were being shot by the RSF and left for dead. And I think everything that we heard from Natty about the satellite imagery and from Emmy about what she's hearing from her contacts is very consistent with that. So I think a very consistent picture emerging. The second thing I would emphasize is that none of this is surprising. All of this was widely anticipated. It has been anticipated for months. I think it has been known to any close observer of Sudan and of the RSF has known what would happen if the RSF took Fasher. And we know that because we saw it happen in El Geneina. When they took El Geneina, they killed thousands upon thousands of civilians, house-to-house killings. That was documented by Human Rights Watch. We saw it when they took Ardamata, and Dan was there on the Eastern Chad border documenting some of the reports from refugees who fled out of Ardamata. And again, very consistent, ethnically targeted house-to-house killings. And that is what now appears to be going on to all reports that we're seeing. That's what appears to be going on in El Fasher as well. So that has been known for a long time that this was the practice of the RSF. It has been known that if they took the largest town in Darfur with hundreds upon thousands of IDPs there as well, that it would be just an absolute catastrophe. And that is what appears to be playing out. At the same time, the RSF, if they stopped this now, there are a lot of people who will otherwise die who could be saved. And the only actor that plausibly has that kind of influence over the RSF is the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has been supplying has been the main weapons supplier to the RSF. This has been widely reported in the press. They are the main financier to the RSF. That too has been widely reported. They've provided diplomatic cover. And in fact, just today, there was a new report out in The Guardian showing that UK-produced weapons of a type sold to the UAE have mysteriously turned up in Sudan in the hands of the RSF. And so it's no real mystery how they got there. And again, it underscores, I think, both the responsibility that the UAE has for what is playing out in Al Fasher right now, and the UAE's unique influence and ability, and probably uniquely in the world, to exert leverage over the RSF to hit stop on what's happening. So some of the things that we believe need to happen, and that we heard requests for from the Mutual Aid Society leaders yesterday in our conversation. First and foremost, obviously, a halt to the ethnic cleansing process that is currently playing out in Al Fasher. Relatedly, the UN must be allowed in to provide aid. As Emmy said, people are starving. They have been without adequate food, water, and medicine for many months, and it's been particularly acute in recent weeks. So the UN must be allowed in with aid, and those same corridors that would be used to bring aid in must also be opened so that civilians can get safely out. Safe humanitarian evacuation corridors was a priority request that we heard from Mutual Aid Society leaders yesterday. And more broadly, the UAE needs to halt providing arms to a genocidal paramilitary group. Countries that sell arms to the UAE need to begin tracking what's happening to those arms. The UK government, I would hope, should be shocked and horrified that their weapons are being used by a genocidal paramilitary group in Sudan. So the UAE must take action, but also countries must take action towards the UAE to hold it accountable for what it has done with the weapons they sold it. Excuse me, pardon. And then it's crucial to surge aid both to the UN and some of the NGOs, but I think even more crucially, to provide really robust support to the Sudanese-led mutual aid groups that are really providing much of the frontline support in the humanitarian response in Sudan and are closest to the humanitarian needs. They have been chronically underfunded throughout this war, and they desperately need and certainly deserve and merit a lot more support than they've gotten. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And we're going to turn to Kate for one more question and comments. But I want to encourage everyone to, again, start adding in your questions at the bottom of the screen at the Q&A box, because we'll turn to those questions next. But first, Kate Ferguson is with Protection Approaches. Kate, Protection Approaches recently issued a statement warning of ethnic cleansing in El Fasher. Could you elaborate on the scale of violence, the targeting, and what steps or you are recommending for the international community to take at this time? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so grateful for so many people making the time to join us at such short notice. It's the most heartening thing that I've seen today. It's been a very, very difficult couple of days. You know, as you've already heard, the evidence coming out of El Fasher, it's harrowing. I spoke this morning to a Darfuri human rights monitor who said, and I quote, you know, the RSF are killing all the Black people in North Darfur. It is systematic. He described what is happening in El Fasher as genocide. I and my organization agree with that. For more than 2 years, the RSF have followed a very clear, practiced, and predicted pattern. They first encircle their target town or city. They weaken it by cutting off access to food, to medicine, to power supplies, the internet. And then when it's weakened, they then overwhelm the population with systematic arson, sexual violence, massacre, and the destruction of vital infrastructure. This is a deliberate strategy to destroy and displace, and that's why I feel the appropriate word is genocide. This is genocide being committed by the same perpetrators against the same victims as 20 years ago. And so it's very important that we understand what is unfolding in El Fasher as continuation of calculated political strategy to remove communities and remove them from their land. We have had so much evidence of this strategy and of the intent behind it. Numbers can sometimes be very hard to verify in Darfur. The intent is not at all difficult to question, and we mustn't. Today, I just find myself asking sort of what more has to take place and how much more evidence do states need for them to say this out loud and to prioritize specifically the protection of civilians, because we know that the trajectory of RSF violence will continue until they are made to stop. As others have said, and I think this is a really important point, this is not an unexpected catastrophe. This is one that we have long feared, and I don't think that there is a foreign minister or a head of state who can claim that they didn't know that this was coming. The atrocities that are now taking place in El Fasher were predictable and indeed were repeatedly predicted. I know this because I have sat alongside colleagues on this call and elsewhere for 2 years. I know that because in June 2004, we warned that without international action, El Fasher was at risk of becoming Srebrenica. I know that in September 2024, we warned that if the city fell, genocide and crimes against humanity would happen. We know that what is taking place now isn't going to end with El Fasher. And so I really want to make that point. It's unacceptable and insincere for people in positions of leadership with responsibilities regarding civilian protection to say they didn't know. And unfortunately, the reality is that even as El Fasher falls, states continue to fail in their obligations to help protect Darfur's civilians, to prevent and punish genocide, and to uphold their stated commitments to prevent mass atrocity crimes. Unfortunately, while the RSF's goals in Darfur have been constant and unrelenting, the same cannot be said for the international community's efforts to protect RSF's victims. This is a collective failure of the most abject kind. This could and it should have been prevented. It is very true that halting genocide and mass atrocities requires political and protection efforts that are distinct from the pursuit of national ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian aid. And I can't tell you how many times we have seen the civilian protection piece fall between the cracks of efforts to end a nationwide conflict and to provide humanitarian aid. There is something distinct that is missing in international efforts around civilian protection that must be plugged. We also know, and Jeremy spoke very clearly, the single most effective action that could bring a protection pause to El Fasher right now is for the right call from Abu Dhabi, the right call from the corners of the Emirates to be placed to the RSF leadership, demanding immediate protection of civilians. That is the thing that will save lives. And so I don't think I need to expand on Jeremy's remarks of the evidence we have there. It is beyond an open secret. And so for any state that believes itself to hold as a priority civilian protection for Darfur, standing up to genocide, pressure on the UAE is the immediate strategic and senior held priority for any state that wishes to sort of uphold its responsibilities. And I think that that is head of state level. That's the seriousness with which we're talking. You know, we need statements, we do, but emergency protection diplomacy in the face of mass atrocity crimes requires much more than publishing outrage. This is when we need heads of states and ministers to hit the phones and work with counterparts, because the majority of civilian protection that exists now in the world is not done by blue helmets. It is actually done on telephones and in corridors. Now, I can talk a little bit more in the questions and answers around sort of policy options that states have, but fundamentally, we need leadership, we need commitment, and we need consistency. And I find it incredibly hard to know where to look for that right now. And I think that that's the reality. No one can say that they didn't know these atrocities would happen. El Fasher's devastating fall, it has to provoke the gear change in international civilian protection that has so long been needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to all the panelists. We're going to open up to Q&A now, and just a reminder to please identify yourself and your affiliation when you put your question into the Q&A box. We have a number of questions already coming in. We'll have any questions we can't get to, we'll have the media contacts for our panelists that we can share at the end as well. But to jump into it, first, a two-part question from Christian Broker. One is any armed resistance to the RSF still ongoing in El Fasher? And then the second, what is your reaction to the public response of the U.S. Senior Advisor for Africa thus far? What actions are you urging the U.S. to take? Let me turn to Emmy to answer that first question, and then Jeremy for the second one. Emmy, go ahead.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for your testimony. The answer is very simple about what's happening on the ground. The SAF has been steadily retreating for a very, very long time. And so the joint forces who support the SAF were the only ones left. There were some people before the media blackout who refused to leave, and they said that they would do everything they can to defend the city. But generally speaking, the SAF deserted, and there were several others as well who left. So in terms of civilian protection, there is no one. And the SAF is considered the sovereign. They are funded by Saudi Arabia, and neither Saudi Arabia nor SAF has, been able to force Burhan to come to the table for peace talks. There were just efforts a couple days ago, and there have been efforts nonstop throughout this war to lead to the end of this war. I do believe that as civilians, both inside Sudan and outside Sudan, we hear constant calls for every party to be held accountable, the UAE and Saudi Arabia being the major players who are funding both sides of the conflict. Most of you who know about what happened in Darfur know that during the start of the genocide, the SAF would carpet bomb our villages, and the Janjaweed, which is the precursor to the RSF, would be waiting outside to kill anyone who emerged. And so for us, it's been very difficult seeing For example, the news, the national news of Sudan, not mentioning Darfur at all and pretending that everything is fine now that Khartoum has been liberated, and then refusing to send any air support, ground support, or any other kind of support, food drops and such, refusing to send that during the siege. So for civilians, for Sudanese civilians and mutual aid groups like ours and the other ones that we support, we cannot stress enough that there is not going to be a humanitarian solution to this war. There needs to be countries upholding their obligations. This is the Srebrenica moment. This is exactly the siege of Sarajevo. And unfortunately, the siege of Sarajevo lasted about 4 years before there was any international intervention and before member states of the UN actually upheld their obligations. What's so difficult about this moment is as we sit here talking about this and talking about the US response, one of the highest people in the RSF, who is the brother of Hemeti, is in DC right now taking meetings. So for us, it's very difficult and, almost unbelievable that we're at a point right now where one, there's no civilian protection on the ground. There's no one left to push back against the RSF, and there is no incentive or push from either the UAE, which is funding the genocidal RSF, or Saudi Arabia, which is funding the formerly genocidal and still committing war crimes SAF. And there's no pressure for Turkey, Egypt, Iran, or Russia, who are also supporting SAF, or Ukraine, who is supporting RSF, or any pressure for example, the Colombian mercenaries that are on the ground. And there's no tracking of the weapons that are being sent. And there is no attempt to sanction any of the RSF leaders whose accounts are in places like the UK and France, whose children are inside the UK and France right now as we speak. These are all very well known and well tracked things. I wrote it in the New York Times a couple months ago that Darfur genocide never ended, that if we don't act before after the Zamzam massacre, we'll be facing the Al-Fasher massacre. The reality of this war is that it is not a civil war. Civilians have never called it a civil war. It is a proxy war for all of the resources in Sudan that includes gold, armies for hire, and there has been spillage of the RSF into South Sudan as well. So the long and very short and very depressing answer is that there is no support on the ground for civilians. And if our presidents and the world leaders don't act right this moment, we will be just sitting and witnessing the final stages of Darfur genocide and the beginning of the rest of the genocide of Sudan. And what I mean by that is that anyone who is of African descent, indigenous groups, we don't say non-Arab, we say indigenous, will be targeted. And at the same time, we've been seeing the same kind of tactics of torture and rape and extrajudicial executions happening all over Sudan. And there are even people who are being targeted for, quote, being Arab in other areas because they're being told that they are RSF supporters. So whether you're a civilian in Darfur or in the Nuba Mountains or in a Jazeera or anywhere, Kurdistan, wherever you are, it is not safe right now, even in Khartoum, because at the flip of a hat, the people in power who have the guns, the people who did the coup against the civilian government, they can and will continue to falsely imprison, disappear, kill, torture everyone. So the reality of this moment is that Sudanese civilians are saying, with all due respect, if you are an ally of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, Egypt, the US, if you are the US, if you are an ally of any of these places, you need to ask in this moment, why it is that civilian lives are so dispensable in this proxy war for all of the resources of one of the most, extensive stretch of arable land in Africa and one of the most geopolitically relevant and important areas, that is the Red Sea and every other part of the Nile and all of the other areas. Sudan is a gateway and it is a backdoor to many, many, many regionally destabilizing problems that have existed in the past several decades. And if we don't act now, if we don't listen to civilians and platform our voices and support to end this war and protect civilians in person, there will be no one left to save.
Thank you, Emmy, and really important points to bring up. We know other parts of the country are also suffering, and we've seen RSF atrocities in North Kordofan in recent days as well. And the points about the role, well, the RSF and UAE are the most egregious and in the spotlight right now with what's happening in Al Fasher, that the SAF and its supporters have also been responsible for many crimes and need to be held accountable. I want to turn to the second question to Jeremy, but also add a related one. So the question was, what is your reaction to the public response of the U.S. Senior Advisor for Africa thus far? What actions are you urging the U.S. to take? And coming from Redmond Shannon from Global News Canada, I think a related question of which international actor is best placed to twist the arm of the UAE to stop the killings? Surely this would be an easy brag for Trump if he could stop it. Over to you, Jeremy.
Well, I think the second question kind of answers the first one. Look, I think the public U.S. statements on this are almost non-existent. There is nothing from Secretary Rubio so far. There is nothing from President Trump. There is a tweet from 2 days ago from Masad Boulos, the U.S. envoy, or rather senior advisor for Arab and African Affairs is his title, which doesn't really reflect the reality of the situation. He said, we call on RSF leaders to continue to issue and publicly communicate clear orders to their forces to ensure the safety of civilians. That is just clearly not what's happening. And that is so detached from the reality on the ground in Al Fasher that well, let's say it's deeply detached from the reality of the ground and of what's happening on the ground in Al Fasher. The U.S. government can see the same satellite imagery that Yale can. They can probably see a lot better satellite imagery than Yale can. There's no excuse not to be aware of what's happening right now. And I would go back to something that Secretary Rubio, then Senator Rubio, said in his confirmation hearing. He was asked about policy towards Sudan by Senator Cory Booker, and he characterized accurately what was happening in Sudan as a genocide. And he also made clear that the U.S. needed to do more to call out the UAE over its role in sponsoring that, which the Biden administration had been very, very painfully reluctant to do. And I think what we're seeing now is Secretary Rubio needs to listen to Senator Rubio. He should be calling out the UAE. He should be doing it publicly. The UAE cares immensely about how it curates its global reputation. There is a reason why you see UAE and Emirates sponsorship over everything from concerts to the Tour de France teams to the NBA tournament that's coming up in the next few weeks. It is because the UAE wants to project a very certain image of itself in the world. And as long as they can do that, I mean, the kind of double game that the UAE is playing here is they are trying to use that sort of project that kind of a public image while out of public view, providing arms to this genocidal paramilitary group. And the strongest point of leverage that Washington or anyone has is to puncture that public image. And so the US should be calling that out. They should be calling the UAE out. They should be doing it publicly because that would put real pressure on the UAE, which would in turn incline it to put more pressure on the RSF. But as long as the UAE is not feeling much heat over what they're doing, they can continue to play this double game. I don't know. I can't say definitively that President Trump could put a stop to this with one call to Abu Dhabi, but if I were him, I'd sure be wanting to try that right now.
Thanks, Jeremy. And just kind of consolidating a couple of the questions, I think a broader question of what can the international community at large do, not just the US or the UAE. And I want to turn over to Kate and then maybe Natty, if you want to come in on this as well. But first, Kate, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important that there's not this sense that it's too late. I can't tell you how many awful conversations I have had with people whose jobs are essentially around thinking about how their state responds to extremely difficult questions about protecting civilians, but those questions are just what the job is. And being said, well, it's too hard, or you know, is it too late, or is the warning urgent enough, or whatever it might be. And so I think it's very important to realize there are always lives that can be saved, and that is the guiding point. States bilaterally and in creative cluster obviously need to demonstrate publicly, yes, condemnation, but beyond, setting out that actually there will be consequences, particularly for those enabling what is taking place. And I think that we have waited far too long and been far too, I think perhaps less robust in the demands and expectations that states that claim to support things like the Genocide Convention and the Human Rights Charter and say that they stand in solidarity with the Sudanese people, and yet are unwilling to call out the UAE for what they are doing. And so I think that there needs to be very clear public leadership, but as I've said before, that needs to be backed up by telephone calls and corridor actions. We also need to have an Emergency Security Council meeting. Now, that's not because it solves everything, and there have been some efforts that have had more success than others at the Security Council, but that is the forum of the international community to resolve the most serious challenges of peace and security, and that is where it should be. Now, my own government, the UK, is penholder on both Sudan and the protection of civilians, and so I think that it has disproportionate responsibility to ensure that emergency session is tabled and takes place in an extremely timely manner, and failure to do so, I'm afraid, does rest with the UK government, you know. And so I think pressuring the UK to uphold its responsibilities, I hope very much that it will be doing so, but you know, that remains to be seen, I suppose. We need to make sure that the international community also does for Taweelah what it has not done for El Janina, Zamzam, and El Fasher. This is a trajectory that will continue. El Fasher was always going to be a particular site of violence, and we need to recognize what Nathaniel was saying at the beginning, that we are but 24 hours in to a campaign that we all on this call believe is going to continue and intensify. So there needs to be emergency and very, very rapid surge at the highest level to secure what I would call a sort of protection pause for the city that needs to come, you know, engaging with RSF command, and that needs to come from UAE. We also need to have a track that is going to be willing to step up and acknowledge RSF violence for what it is. Now, it should have happened already, but if it's not going to be El Fasher and the evidence that we already have that demonstrates the intent they hold towards certain communities in Darfur, then we're in real trouble. So they need to take this pivot and they need to shift their language immediately. Otherwise, we're going to see what is happening in Darfur happening in Taweelah in a couple of months' time, or whatever that timeline might be. Now, I would like to see a resurrection or a revival of an idea that a number of us were pushing ahead of the conference on Sudan that was held in London in April earlier this year, where we're essentially, you know, we realize that there is no functioning vehicle where the specific obligations regarding the prevention of further mass atrocities and the protection of civilians can be advanced, because it does not fit easily into ceasefire efforts. It does not fit at all easily into humanitarian response, most particularly when that humanitarian aid and access is itself being weaponized as a tool of starvation, famine, and violence against civilians. And so we need to have, you know, whether it is a coalition of conscience, whether it is an extremely kind of high-level ministerial working group, I don't care what you call it, but we need to have some sort of leadership mechanism at ministerial level at least, where responsibility to seek protection option solutions can be taken forward. And lastly, of course, and it has been said by others on this call, donors need to be much, much bolder, much more direct, and have a far higher risk appetite in supporting the resilience of civilian communities in Darfur, in Kordofans, and across Sudan to withstand atrocity crimes. And this, you know, this is hard. None of this stuff is easy, but it should be easier than some of the other options on the table, right? This could include providing supplies and material to protect and maintain access to core services. It can be thinking around what civilian-led protection and medical services can look like, supplying cameras and satellite phones. You know, there are lots of things there that can be done. And, you know, there are some states that I've been talking to who've been rolling around this idea for 8 months and they've still not done anything. You know, stop talking about it, get going. So I think there are a number of things that can be done that are concrete. Unfortunately, it needs to be someone's job at senior level in states and institutions that hold the responsibility of developing and advancing protection options, recognizing that that requires thinking outside the box, not going with the tide of this constant depreciation of ambition that has been utterly dominant in these conversations, and to take it forward. So there are a number of things that can be done, I think, either bilaterally in groups or through the UN system.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate that, and the specifics on what can be done in terms of protecting people right away, and also a big support for the call for the urgency of an immediate UN Security Council session. And that's something that we raised in a Refugees International statement, which maybe one of my colleagues can share in the chat. I want to turn now to Natty to talk about the options for what we need for international response, but also if you can talk a little about how aid organizations are able to operate amid the reports of the ongoing violence and siege conditions. Over to you, Natty.
So I'm going to be very brass tacks here. We don't have any time right now, and so in a perfect world, the President of the United States would put MQ-1 Predators in the sky over Al Fasher right now, and tell RSF that they're being watched and that there are armed US drones over their head right now. We are at a point where 2 hours could be thousands of people. 10 hours could be tens of thousands more. And so basically what should be happening right now is there should be a show of force and a direct call out to UAE immediately that they will be sanctioned if they don't stop right this minute. Okay, the pace at which the international community is moving, if it continues that way, we're going to have mass body piles by the end of the week, and we're going to have houses on fire. That's where we're going to be. And so the reality is that we laid these options out multiple times over 6 meetings with UN Security Council elements, with US government, with the British government, with the French government, basically saying they had to be ready for a protection kinetic option in the summer of last year. Okay, even earlier than that. And so right now, if we turn this into, you know, some sort of symposium or press release festival, it isn't gonna work. We have to move with equal audacity in terms of protection options right now, with threat of kinetic and threat of sanctions right now. And that has to be clear. This cannot be something settled by press conference. It has to be something settled by immediate action. That is likely not going to happen. And so to answer the second part of the question on the aid situation, we haven't hit bottom yet on the crisis on top of the crisis, which is Tooele. We now know this morning that SAF is retreated in through Tooele into Jebel Mara territory. And so we have an additional crisis that can break out here, which everyone needs to be focused on from an aid operations side, which is RSF makes a move on those who've made it to Tooele, including the hundreds of humanitarians there assisting civilians. In terms of an evacuation situation for those civilians and the aid organizations assisting them, it would be a nightmare in the current scenario. And so we need planning for what happens with Tooele if Tooele goes under siege or those security conditions change there, and what happens in terms Now we have to do that while simultaneously figuring out how to logistically surge assistance into Tooele. I want everyone to be clear here that for those on the road, they are now in another form of danger if they have not been taken, harassed, beaten, extorted, killed. The problem is they've been starving for 15 months. They've been under IPC 5, highest level of famine since last year, as was mentioned. That means they calorically, in terms of their access to water and to calories, they, as we saw with the Zamzam flight, people are dying on the road due to the fact that they're too weak to run. And so we have a situation where Tooele needs surge up immediately. Tooele is also in potential danger. And we have comms dark with our humanitarian colleagues across the region. So we have comms down. We don't know who has been taken already. We know that some personnel is unaccounted for. And so we are in a situation right now where it is as bad as it gets, and it can actually get a hell of a lot worse very quickly.
Thanks, Natty. I want to turn back to Emmy to fill in on the, you have your network that's on the ground trying to get aid into people. What is the situation? What would be most helpful and the most needed support in this emergency phase right now?
Thank you so much. It's very meaningful to be here. I will say that, just like Natty said, and we've been saying this for a very long time, especially Sudanese civilians. We've raised the alarm ages ago saying that, look, nowhere is safe right now. The whole Al-Fasher was the last city that was not, um, you know, taken over by RSF. So if we were to evacuate people from Tooele, there is nowhere safe to go that is nearby, and that's just to illustrate how difficult and dangerous the situation is and why it is that we've been pushing for so long. I will say that for us, we do, just like all of the other mutual aid groups together, we all work together. We do mobile clinics, mobile kitchens, and IDP Humanitarian Network, we build mobile societies. Many of the people who are in Al Fasher and in Tooele and our families in general have been displaced more than 5 to 6 or 7 times. Just so you understand, there were already 2 million people who were internally displaced inside Darfur before April 15, 2023. So that 2 million has swelled drastically. And in December, all the way through March, and I think April as well, there were hundreds of villages that were burned. Same villages that were burned in the early 2000s, and again in 2017, and again in 2013 when the RSF was created and aid groups were forced to withdraw. All of those people escaped to Zamzam. And then Zamzam was destroyed. So all of them escaped to other parts of Al Fasher, to Tooele, and to other areas. And now, if Tooele gets hit, all of the people who were survivors of the Darfur genocide and survivors of this ongoing war and other massacres will be in danger. The reality on the ground is that we don't have enough resources currently or funding to make even enough meals a day, and we also have a lot of people who are going to come injured. We have a lot of people who are going to come needing a lot of medical assistance, and we're only able to, so far, the fastest way that we do it is we do cash transfers to our coordinators on the ground, and the coordinators on the ground assess the need, and they're able to bring it out to the coordinators in the diaspora, and then we mobilize aid as quickly as we can. We have been, as Sudanese groups, the implementation partner for international organizations for a very long time. So the modus operandi right now, especially in Darfur, is that the INGOs rely on mutual aid groups to actually deliver the last mile. And that's been the case for more than 20 years, and it's especially the case now. So my very, very clear answer is that we definitely don't have enough already for the people who are already in Tooele. Now to have others who might escape, whoever may make it to Tooele, we don't have enough support for them either. And on top of that, as we've seen what happened with Al Fasher, when you're basically subsisting on whatever aid is able to trickle in to mutual aid groups, the reality is if, again, we get choked off or there's a siege, there's not going to be any stores or any food left to hold anyone over. So we can't risk not having enough resources mobilized. And there is a lot of aid that's sitting in other areas being held hostage by Janjaweed and RSF in general. And then there's also the very, very painful reality that a lot of times throughout this war, aid has been stolen or burned or destroyed. The last thing I want to say is in terms of pressuring the UAE, I want to make it very clear that it's not just Himeti that needs to be pressured. There's also Al Tahir Hajar from SLA. There's also Al Hadi Idris and Suleiman Sandal. These are the people whose armies are active on the ground right now, committing the massacres. It's all part of RSF and it's all part of one entity. But the reality is that RSF is this big monster and it's very, very difficult to actually control any part of it. I'm sure that if President Trump were to make a call to Abu Dhabi today, there would be a difference. But if it's not clear that we also need protection or we also need eyes in the sky or boots on the ground, as Darfur has been calling for the past 2 years or longer, we they're not going to be able to do anything. And that's why for civilians, it's been very, very clear that without incentive for RSF and SAF to end the war, it's going to be very difficult. No one is saying that we're drawing a false equivalency. We're not. We're saying that there is zero tolerance for genocide. If you know that a genocide is happening in your country and you've been designated a sovereign by the UN and you do nothing to stop it, or you turn a blind eye and say that, oh, there's other priorities, you are allowing the genocide to continue. And the reality on the ground is that the last that we heard is that even though very, very traditional RSF people, Janjaweed, are committing the mass killings, other members are not doing anything to stop it. And so there are people who are being killed. There's people who are being lynched. A lot of the videos have racial epithets being said. Everyone is being called indigenous just based on the color of their skin and just based on the fact that they're in Fasher. And the last thing I want to say that I think we missed is that for the past, since April, boys and men ages 17 to 70 is what they said, have not been allowed to leave. So if you're caught leaving or trying to smuggle in food, that's right, in 2025, we're trying to smuggle in food to Al-Fasher, you are killed. And the reality is that after a certain time, they didn't let anyone out. So anyone who's been captured trying to bring food into Al-Fasher recently has been killed. Anyone trying to escape now has been killed. So what we need on the ground is we need civilian protection. Clearly, we need civilian protection. Diplomatic channels are not enough right now because we've been saying that for a very, very long time. But the reality is that the way that the RSF is, it's very, very hard to believe that a command is going to be given by Himeti and then people on the ground are going to follow it. By that time, we'll have lost many, many people. And when I say that if we don't move, there will be no one left, what I mean by that isn't that it's impossible to do anything. I mean that if we don't act now, just like we didn't act before, we're just going to see the massacres accumulate as they've been doing so over time. This is the largest humanitarian crisis of our time. It is often dismissed as a civil war, as an internal struggle. It is not. It is a continuation of the Darfur genocide. It is a proxy war. It is the biggest preventable humanitarian crisis of our time. And there is still time to do something about it. So I would say anyone who has the power, call out the UAE, call Saudi Arabia to pressure the SAF to come to the table. Just a couple of days ago, they said they wouldn't come to the table if UAE or RSF is in. I think they said if the UAE is involved. The reality is there's always excuses being thrown around, but there isn't enough action. And so civilians are left to be the buffer, and all we have is our own bodies. So we need aid and we need action.
Thank you, Emmy. And I would just add to that the broader point of even if we can push for access, something that's going to affect this response is the global aid cuts that we've seen, in particular the U.S. and the dismantling of USAID and the experts who are best placed for these kind of emergency responses. We have time for one more quick question, and since we have a lot of journalists on the line, I wanted to just ask a question about any comments or suggestions. Particularly, we've seen reports of journalists being detained on how to safely and responsibly continue to report on this emergency. Anyone want to jump in to take that?
I just want to say that, even Sudanese journalists right now have been detained. Um, I think Ahmad is one of them. There's a lot of people on the ground who have been detained, and they're being forced to kneel and essentially pledge fealty to the RSF. And even then, they're being killed. So what I would say is that platform as many voices as you can. For the past couple of months, we've been doing everything we can as IDP Humanitarian Network, and we also, run several. I'm a co-founder and coordinator for several of the ERRs that we started on the ground. We all work together because on the ground we're all one. We've been connecting people to journalists. We've been getting voices from the ground, and we're going to continue our efforts to document the atrocities. So if there are any journalists here who want to hear from anyone who has managed to make it out, who wants to hear from people like us who are, I'm a survivor of the Darfur genocide, and I've been a public speaker since I was 10 years old. We're now working on the same issues that produced us. We're former refugees. There's people everywhere who are ready to speak, but there is not enough incentive or attraction for people to speak about it. All I see in the news is stuff about the East Wing. But I will say that for us, if you want to talk to anyone in Sudan, we're ready to connect you in terms of civilians. And if you want to hear from us, if there are things that people don't understand or don't know, I'm happy to teach, to support. So many of us are here, and we're ready to educate, and we're ready to partner. And I would be remiss if I did not say all of us on the ground understand that none of us are free until all of us are free. So a step forward for Gaza, for Ukraine, for the Congo, for any place that is suffering right now is a step forward for anyone who is suffering. And it goes the same for Sudan. This belief that if you support one issue, you can't support others is ridiculous, especially in 2025 when we're seeing literal mass graves and hangings happening. To me, as somebody who's been in this space for a very long period of time, and as someone who's learned to be resilient in these moments, to feel everything deeply and seriously, but quickly because we don't have time. I have to say that for us, Sudan is part of the world. It's not an afterthought. And Darfur is part of Sudan. And we're all in this together. So, us spending this time to appeal to you means that there is a certain level of hope and trust that something will come out of this. We are here. And if there's any kind of diplomatic or Security Council or peace process, please include civilians. I think that if we had done that from the beginning, we might have been able to avoid some of this, but it's not too late now to avoid what is coming next because we've seen it and we've already lived it. Um, yeah, so it's not a guessing game about what's happening next. We've seen it, we live it every day. Please talk to us. Don't help us without us.
Thank you, Emmy. And that's a good point to end on, to say that we will have a recording of this available, and we'll send out media contacts if people have follow-up. And want to thank our panelists and everyone for joining. And also, just to end on one question about what advocacy opportunities there are, just want to flag that Refugees International and partners will be launching a campaign aimed at the role of the UAE in sponsoring the Emirates NBA Cup. First game starts on Friday. And so you can go to speakoutsudan.org to get more information about that. Again, thank you to all of our panelists and for everyone for joining.